show, but he enlightened me on a lot of things, and he wrote a column that really pointed the finger toward Patsy Ramsey. I'm joined by Jeff Hansen here on Right from the Author, and Dr. Cyril Wecht, nice enough to come back for part 2. Dr. Wecht, this really would take many hours to discuss this case. It's one of the most bizarre murders of all time, especially a young child like this. And I'll tell you, as you get into the autopsy, this was a brutal murder. When I said we cannot show
let's talk about how brutal this was. Okay,
we will. And you know what? It is so brutal we can't even show it here on television. I've seen the autopsy report, but go ahead and describe really what you know about the autopsy.
Okay. Well, let me say the little girl is found. There is a rope around her neck. Interestingly, the underneath the rope is the sweater or jersey that she's wearing. So and the rope around the right wrist also has the jersey underneath it. So think about that. In other words, no marks, right? Are going to be left with the ropes. Just think about that for a while.
Yeah.
And you'll see in a moment. Now, when they do the autopsy, they find an 8.5-inch fracture from the front to the rear, the frontal to the occipital portion of the skull. All right, now that indeed is a very horrific blow. I agree, but guess what? How much blood is found in association with that 8.5-inch fracture? 7 cc's. That is less than 1.5 teaspoons. Less than 1.5 teaspoons.
Wow.
If you hit somebody on the head and you produce a fracture on the top of the skull, number one, you're not going to cause sudden death because the brainstem, which controls cardiac and respiratory activity, that is located in the rear and inferior part of the brain, and that is going to continue to function. So while the person is alive, no matter how seriously stunned, and no matter how fatal the injury may ultimately prove to be, life goes on, during which time there's some bleeding, admittedly slowed down a little as cardiac function begins to diminish, but bleeding continues. There's no way in the world that you're going to have an 8.5-inch fracture producing only 7 cc's of blood. That's nothing. That's just seepage. Now, the point that I wish to make is this. That blow was inflicted when the little girl was dead or dying. That blow was inflicted to simulate a brutal, horrific attack. And she was already dead. What was she dead from? She was dead from a vagal reflex.
Strangle.
Rope around the neck. Well, not quite strangulation. It's similar. We have, I don't want to make this too technical, but let me just, so you'll understand it. There are 12 cranial nerves. They're extensions of the brain. They go to the eyes. They go to the ears, to the nose. They permit us to hear and smell and see, et cetera, et cetera. The 10th nerve is the most multifaceted, so to speak. It's called the vagus nerve. It goes all the way down the side of the neck, one on each side, right and left. It enters into the chest cavity. It sends fibers to the heart and lungs, even sends fibers down into the abdomen, to the GI tract, and all the way to the urinary bladder. The vagus nerve is what keeps your heart beating. While we're talking, you haven't thought, have you, gentlemen, about, gee, I'm going to make my heart beat, right? We've been talking and everything else you do. The vagus nerve is taking care of this for you. When you apply pressure to somebody's neck, that pressure on the vagus nerve can lead to a slowing down of the heart called bradycardia. Bradycardia, slowing down. And once the heart begins to slow down, then it will go on to beat irregularly, cardiac arrhythmia or dysrhythmia. And once that happens, then you begin to get respiratory depression, and then the brain doesn't get oxygen, the brain gets more insulted, and that leads to further depression of cardiac and respiratory function. The little girl died from a vagal reflex caused by pressure of the rope around her neck. And now when she could not be resuscitated, she could not be brought back to life, that is when the blow was inflicted. In order to make it appear that there was an outside intruder who inflicted this blow and caused and murdered this little girl.
Not only do we get to hear right from the author, we also get some education in the medical field.
Fantastic.
That is an awesome point, Dr. Wecht. Go ahead, Jeff.
My question
Well, I just wanted to wrap that up.
Yes.
The point I want to make here, there was no intention to murder this girl. There was no intention to harm this girl physically. None at all. And I also believe, let me finish up with the autopsy, this was a game that had been played before. How do I know that? Because let's talk now about the external genitalia.
Yes.
Let's talk about the injuries. You've got this brutal killer and rapist, right? Well, guess what? The injuries are, for the most part, old. They're chronic. A good part of the hymen is absent, and that's an old phenomenon. It's been there for a while. Then the pathologist reports, and I'm taking it right from the autopsy report, he reports superficial erosion of the vaginal mucosa. That's the lining, the delicate lining of the vaginal canal at the 7 o'clock position. And that's been there for a while. That's not acute. And then he finds microscopically chronic inflammation under the microscope. That means it's been there for days and could be longer than days, but it's not fresh. And then he finds also birefringent material under polarized light. What that means is that you put a blue prism in your microscope and you'll see something that you won't see with a regular microscopic light. And you know what the most common source of birefringent material is in your home and mine? Talcum powder.
Talcum powder, okay.
Talcum powder, okay? So you guys, you're beginning to get a picture here?
Yeah, really.
A little
put a lot of pieces
superficially.
in the puzzle.
Ask your and I do this not to be crude or insensitive, but let's just talk. You have your lady listeners, your own wives, and so on, and ask. I always do as ladies. Just think you're on the examining table, and the gynecologist is examining you, performing a digital vaginal examination, a right-handed examiner. Where does the examining finger go? How about the 7 o'clock position, right? Think of that. Follow me? So you got that superficial erosion at the 7 o'clock position, and you have the chronic inflammation, and you have absence of a significant part of the hymen. Do you think this is a game that has been played before? What do you think?
Yeah.
That's unbelievable that on Christmas, you're talking, obviously this has been something that had been going on for God knows how long.
I can't tell you how long.
Right, but then you have, it's Christmas.
Come back to our outside intruder. All of this is done. All of this is done with no evidence of the most de minimis nature left by this intruder, but then years later they latch on to this. Oh, we found some DNA on her underwear. That proves that there was somebody else there. Give me a break.